Welcome to the TC Dojo from Single Sourcing Solutions. The TC Dojo is a public works project for the TechCom community. It's driven by you. Through the survey, you tell us what you want to learn. Instructors are community experts who are willing to share their learning on the topics you've asked for. With the TC Dojo, we celebrate the dojo, a place of learning and meditation. When we created the dojo, we did extensive research to be as faithful as possible to the historic and cultural traditions and the intent behind them. The TC Dojo exterior image was drawn in the Japanese minimalist architectural style. Minimalism is an important practice in technical and professional communications. It can be found in architecture, art, and music from many different traditions and cultures. We draw from these examples when we discuss minimalism in our training to help students coming from a variety of backgrounds and cultures to connect. In the open session today, we have Saul Carliner. Saul's had a double career as an academic and professional in both technical communication and workplace learning. He's currently a professor at Concordia University in Montreal, specializing in the design of materials for communication and learning, the management of groups that produce these materials, and related issues of professionalism. He's the author of several books, including the one most relevant to this presentation. You can see it in the background, Career Anxiety Guidance for Tough Times. He's the president of the Canadian Network for Innovation in Education, a fellow and past international president of STC, past editor of the IEEE Transactions on Professional Communication, and recipient of the Jay Gould Award for Excellence in Teaching. He also received the Keith Rainey Award for Excellence in Research and several Best of Show awards in STC Awards competitions.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you everyone for being here. I recognize a number of familiar names in the audience, so it's great to see all of you, even if it's kind of virtually and not without your camera. It's still nice to have you in the same room with me even today. So today I'm here to talk about career frameworks. And what I'd like to do to get started is, do you formally plan your career? Again, do you formally plan your career? And for those of you a little bit further into your career, you can change the tense of that to have you formally planned your career. Career planning is actually quite an interesting area these days because it's not the same as it used to be. And I'm here today to talk about one and only one topic, and that's career frameworks. So to get started, I first would like to contrast it with something called career ladders, which is probably a much more familiar term. And let me tell you a story about a coworker of mine when I began my career as a tech writer. And I worked in a large, we called it a writing factory. There were 120 of us in a publications group. And one of the people that all of us, especially the newer tech writers, looked up to was a guy named Mark. That's not his real name. I may use a pseudonym here. The best way of describing Mark is that he was perfect. He's still alive. He's still perfect. Guy had perfect weight, perfect worker, and a perfectly nice human being. So even if you wanted to hate him, you couldn't, because he was a nice, competent guy. And what was really neat about Mark was that he also was a source of inspiration to us. When we got started in our careers, the company that we worked for had what's called a dual career track. So the first few levels were for individual contributors. But once you reached a certain point, you branched off either into a management track or an individual contributor track. And you could go back and forth between the two. But what that meant in practical terms was your advancement in the company was not limited by the fact that you may not be a great manager, because the company had learned that just because you were a great engineer as an individual contributor doesn't mean you're particularly good at managing other engineers and so forth. And so in tech writing, we knew that we had, in theory, this path. But what happened was anyone who reached like the 5th promotion, which was relatively high up, it took them at least 20 and usually 25 years, and they only went into that individual contributor path at that level after they had been a second level manager. And what we really needed on the ground was evidence that someone who was not a manager at that point, who had only been an individual contributor, could still move into that slot, still move into that promotion. And that's where Mark really became important to us as a role model, because Mark actually moved into that role. And not only did he do it, The other managers it took them at least 15 to 20 years to get to that level. And Mark did it in 12. And so it was an inspiration to us on two different levels. One is that you did not need to go into management to get to that level. And two, you could accomplish it before you died, which when you're 22, 23, 24 years old, even 32, 33 seems like a lifetime away, because literally it's about a third of your life. It's half of the life that you've lived to that point. And Mark's career after that actually exemplifies what goes on in a traditional career ladder. He eventually did go into management, and he stayed with the company for almost 30 years. And at that point, the company had redone its retirement system so that you could stay 30 years, you could stay 50 years, but they only counted the first 30 years of service towards your retirement. So there was no incentive to stay anything beyond 30 years. And so he left and became a second line manager at another company. And he finished up his career there. And now he is retired. He works as a freelance writer, basically doing ghostwriting for people about family bios and stuff like that. And he spends 1 to 2 days a week with his wife babysitting his grandchildren, which really is something that they enjoy a lot. This is an example of a career ladder with dual tracks. You start off maybe at a junior level, then you become an associate. You stay in that job for 2 to 5 years. Become a senior associate. You may stay in that job for 5 to 10 years. Then you might move either into the individual contributor track, which is on the left, a staff engineer, and that job can last from 3 to 20 years, including being the one that people retire in. An advisory engineer, you might get there after 3 years for being a staff engineer, but it could take you up to 25 years to get that. And for a few, because not many people made it to this level, you become a senior manager, a senior engineer. And each one of those jobs equated with a different line of management. The staff job aligned with the first line of management, the advisory job with the middle management job, and the senior job to a senior management job. And then there were some additional positions, executive positions beyond this. And most of those positions did involve some management role or prepping for a management role. So a little bit different there. And that's for those of us that began our careers in the 80s, 90s, and perhaps even in the early 2000s. This is what we were told to expect. But at the same time, especially towards the end of the 80s to the early 2000s, we saw things happen that kind of eroded this. The number one thing being lifetime employment with a single employer no longer was something that most people could count on. So if you were going to move up the ladder, you were not going to do that in a single employer. You were going to do that by hopping from one employer to the next employer to the next employer. It didn't mean people didn't do that before. It was just far less common. So this brings me to share a second career path, one by someone who started with me when I began my career. She actually began about 6 months after me. Her name, it's a pseudonym, is Teresa. What was really interesting about Teresa is that Teresa began basically starting just like Mark did. And she started as a junior writer, went to an associate, senior associate, and then she went into the management track. And she went a couple of levels of management. But at about 25 years in her career, she started to realize she was stalled. She was going absolutely nowhere. So what Teresa did was she revived her career, not by trying to find a way to move up, but to find a way to move around. And what Teresa did was she went and got an executive MBA. She took a buyout from the company, and then she went on to become a project manager for different companies. The project management stints would last between 3 months, and maybe 15 to 24 months. And when she finished one stint, she moved on to the next. And the idea behind these was they would leverage her past expertise in a meaningful way, and at the same time would allow her to expand her skill base and her experience base. And this is what becomes important, because what happens in a career framework is that the goal is not to simply just move up, but it's to stay employed. And that's not a small challenge today, because people are employed. Back in the 80s, people were looking forward to retiring somewhere between age 55 and 65. So if you were 22 in 1980, you expected to retire in maybe 33 to 43 years. These days, people tend to work anywhere from The system is designed increasingly to discourage people from retiring before age 67. So we're looking at a minimum of 45 years. And increasingly, we're going to see that incentives will be put in place to keep people in the workforce as long as possible, perhaps in people's 70s and 80s. In fact, the largest growing segment of the workforce is not in their 20s, not in their 30s, not in their 40s. It's people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. Some of them have left the workforce and for a variety of different reasons need to return. Sometimes it's economic, sometimes it's intellectual, sometimes it's a combination of the two. But the idea is to remain employable. And when the goal is to remain employable over as long as a half of century of effort, there's not always going to be a move up. And when you even look at traditional corporate careers, most people had anywhere between 3 and 5 promotions over the course of their 33 to 43-year careers. So what do you do in addition to that if the guideline is just to keep moving? Well, what you do is you look for a variety of different experiences as much as possible within the same job family. So think about the field of technical communication. Nominally, the most common job is the technical writer. But if you look at a lot of our literature, one of the things that we really emphasize is you don't want to just be a tech writer. You can be a usability consultant. You can be an editor. You can be a content strategist. You can take on a more techie role and become a systems expert for publishing systems. You can go on and become a project manager, an account executive in the field, or you can become a manager. The other thing that you could do is move among all of those different roles. So let's say you've been tech writing for a number of different years and you've primarily been working on, let's say, API documentation. And you might realize, you know what? I've been doing this for 10 years. I'm kind of sick of it. I still want to be a writer, but I don't want to write this stuff anymore. Well, you can leverage that experience as a writer. You can leverage your technical knowledge of the technology that you've been writing about, but write a different kind of material. You can move into marketing writing, instructional design, and developing educational materials. Or you can write user guides or other types of materials. Or you can write service documentation. There's a number of different ways you can apply that. Other people want to get all that experience within the same job. The idea is to acquire. So the idea is, at the very least, it's just you're still a writer, but you move among genres. In other cases, you say, you know what, I need a break from writing. I want to do something else. So in that particular case, then you take on a different job. In the engineering world, what would happen is you could go between being a product engineer, a quality engineer, a product designer, project manager, manufacturing engineer, a scrum leader, a technical trainer, engineering manager, all leveraging the same base of skills and knowledge, but playing different roles. And every time you play different roles, 2 things happen. One is you gain additional skills, and the other thing is that you gain additional experience. And in theory, employers hire people for skills. But what doesn't get mentioned as much is that people also get hired for their experience, because the skills tell you people what you might be capable of. Describing your experience tells people how you have applied those skills and how you have managed through adversity on projects and succeeded. And ultimately, employers want to know, how can you handle situations on the job? And will it be in a responsible way that will allow us to proceed with our projects on a timely manner? And so one of the things that you look for as you move through a career framework is not just simply you want to remain employable, but you want to use your current job to make you more qualified for the next job. So you're looking at what skills can I develop and what experiences can I develop? So let's look at this in the context of a technical communicator's career. So again, the goal is to stay employable, but you may start your career as a technical writer. You may move into marketing communication. You may move then after that, instructional design. Notice that occasionally you switch employers and sometimes you switch into a different role in the same employer. But these first jobs, what the person does is they expand their skill base within the field of writing. So they've got a much broader based set of communication skills and experiences to bring to an employer. They use that to leverage into a position as an account executive, which is someone in a work either internally or externally. They can work in both situations. but they basically are the liaison between the technical communication group and the group that is hired or is working with the technical communicators to get the information documented and out to the intended audiences. And then after being an account executive, the person works as an independent contractor, doing a number of different jobs on a, as needed basis. Then they move to another employer, become a project manager. They've been on projects, they've worked with clients. Now they've leveraged that to managing projects. After that, they move into a communications management role where they actually supervise workers directly. And then after that, they spend 6 years in that job with the fifth employer. And then they move into a consulting and contracting role where they do some contracting, which is defined as you get a defined assignment and your job is to complete it. And some jobs are consulting where they get a very undefined project and they have to put some definition around it and then determine how to address that undefined problem in a practical way. Some of the things about career frameworks is that they address the realities of the 21st century. Number one, people are working longer, as I mentioned earlier. The second issue is that jobs become obsolete. And this happens in technical communication all the time. Sometimes it's because the technology that we are writing about is no longer viable, or a new technology really takes over the market and there just isn't demand for the older technology. And I think one of the areas where we've seen this is the rise of mobile apps. This most recent years, but I can go back earlier in my career and I'm getting kind of old. So I remember when people used to write about mainframe computers and military specs, and mainframe, it's not that mainframe computers went away and it's not that we stopped spending money on defense, but we stopped spending as much and the personal computer replaced the mainframe. And for many years, there was a de-emphasis on military spending and that money went into domestic spending. The other thing is that there are shorter term jobs. Employers, when they hire you for a permanent position, it's not necessarily until retirement. It's more likely that they want an ongoing relationship with you, but should the need for your services no longer exist, they will no longer work with you. Contingent is they know that they only have a short-term need, and so therefore they're not going to make a long-term commitment. And that's because there's a variety of factors affecting that. But one of the reasons is employers just simply need the flexibility to be able to change their staffing mix on a dime. And the other issue is they're trying to minimize the amount of overhead expense that they have or ongoing commitments. And a salary is an ongoing commitment, where contingent work, it's a financial transaction. And so some of the strategies that people take when working on career frameworks is, first of all, as I've mentioned several times, the goal is to acquire skills and experiences. So how do you do that? Well, one of the best ways is through the assignments that you choose. And one of the best ways of looking at these is you want to look for stretch assignments. And if you're not familiar with the term stretch assignment, a stretch assignment is one that stretches your skills. It's one that you think ultimately you can do it, but there will be moments of, and I mean this in a loving way, there'll be moments of terror when you think about, like, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? And the idea is that you want to put yourself in a place where you need to stretch, where you need to grow. And it is admittedly kind of scary. But when you succeed, and almost always people usually do, when you succeed, there's a tremendous feeling of accomplishment. Plus, that success will propel you on to future success in other positions. The next thing is to develop what we call complementary skills. So when we talk about technical communicators, and even with certification, we primarily focus on the skills that are unique to technical communication, like writing, editing, content management, etc. But we often don't focus on some general skills that are needed to remain employable in the workplace. So collaborating with other people, communicating effectively interpersonally, learning how to manage a meeting, learning how to be responsive to requests and meet your requests on schedule, on time, on budget. Some of which is covered in the competencies that we have for technical communication, but often are not. The other thing is, as we get older, some of these, and this is very hard for me to say, but it's something I've observed in a lot of people, including myself. We tend to, some of our interpersonal skills become a little bit more, how do I put this? They get rusty with time. And the problem is that people don't like working with difficult people. Now, granted, as we get more experience, one of the challenges is we know what we are comfortable with and what we're not comfortable with. We know what we want, are willing to put up with, and what we're not willing to put up with. But sometimes the things that people are things that they're uncomfortable with and not willing to put up with are the things that really annoy their coworkers. And that gets you a reputation as a difficult worker or someone who's not willing, who's obstinate and not willing to change. And that's something that you really can't risk in a situation like the current employment market. So one of the things that you'll need to do is assess, how do people feel about working with me? Which is not something you can go up and say, hey, how do you feel about working with me? It's something where you'll need, first of all, to be able to read other people's body language and read between the lines sometimes without becoming paranoid. And at the same time, you also need to have a really good confidant who can tell you if perhaps you need to work on something. At the same time, you need to maintain current skills with technologies and processes, which means basically you need to know the current state of the art for different technologies and processes, whether or not they use them in your organization. So if you're working with an organization that's still using, WordPerfect, okay, you have a job, but it's not exactly having current skills. Same thing, if you're working with a waterfall process, you may want to start working, at least become familiar with agile processes, because these are increasingly common in tech comm environments. And as I say, you need to constantly assess your general or complementary skills. And so this is the difference between frameworks and ladders. Ladders are always focused on moving up, but there's a limit to how far you will go. Frameworks are looked at maintaining your employability. But just remember, it's like, well, it doesn't look like you're moving anywhere other than in circles. To some extent, it might feel that way, but you also have to remember, the more skills and more experiences that you have, the more complex the projects that you get. And so while you may not have a title that always reflects the move up, your responsibilities will, and in many cases, the salary will reflect the increase in responsibilities, including the scope of the work. So in other words, are you affecting just a single part of a project, an entire project, or an entire division or corporation? The broader that scope, the more important the project, and the more you're likely to be in the vanguard and being compensated and recognized as such.
Thanks for watching this episode of the TC Dojo, hosted by Single Sourcing Solutions. Be sure to subscribe to our channel. We bring experts from the professional communications industry to share their knowledge every month. If you also subscribe to our mailing list, you will get invitations to attend future sessions live, where you can network with peers and the expert presenters themselves. Sign up today at join.tcdojo.org.